Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Chris. That was really a great section of worship. Okay. So, when my older daughter was a lot younger, when she was small, sometimes she used to get into trouble. And so if she'd done something like, I don't know, just for example, say she got a pair of scissors and cut off her younger sister's hair and hidden all the pieces under a cushion, for example. She had a very good answer. So if we said, Joy, what's this hair here? She would say, I can't know that. And that was a very clever phrase, because what that actually meant was, I can't let myself think about that. Because if I do, I might have to admit that I've done something wrong. And the subject we're going to be talking about today is a bit like that, because we're going to be talking about suffering and about why good people suffer. And I think sometimes as Christians, we have a bit of the same attitude there. We just think, well, I can't know that. That is the thing that's a bit difficult to think about, because it really challenges us. It's a bit unanswerable, and so we don't like to think about it too much. But I think that just makes it all the more important that we do think about it, actually. So, well, the good news is that there is a whole book in the Bible all about this question, and that's the so that's there for us, and that's the book of Job. The bad news is that people have been trying to understand it for centuries. And it's a very mysterious and complicated and tantalizing book. But we're going to have a look at it this morning and just see what we can learn about it. So I don't know if there's any Americans here this morning. I don't think so. I apologise if there is. The reason I call this Good Job Job is that my older son and daughter-in-law were working in the States until quite recently, and one of the things they really picked up was to say, good job. And so as soon as I thought of Job, I thought, good job, Job, because I actually think he did do quite a good job. And as I say, the subject is going to really, the topic is really about why do good people suffer. And there's a picture on there that I don't think has come out very well, unfortunately. You might not be able to see it very well. And even if you could see it, it probably wouldn't make that much sense. But we'll explain that a little bit later. So, Job is quite a long book, and we're not going to read it all through today, but what I thought I'd like to do is just have a very quick overview of what happens. So I've done myself a sort of, there's 42 chapters, I think, in Job, and I've got it onto a couple of pages. And really, it divides into 6 very distinct bits. And the first part is really an introduction about Job. And the first thing we learn about Job, the first bit is an introduction. And the first bit we learn about Job is basically he's got a swimming pool, 2 Ferraris and a yacht. And now I know what you're going to say, Mark. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's ridiculous. A Ferrari is going to be useless in that climate. But the point is, he was very rich. He got oodles of camels and donkeys and so on. God had blessed him. He got a lovely family, 7 sons and 3 daughters. But he still feared God. He knew where those blessings had come from. It says that after his children had been out and had a party, he would go the next morning and make sacrifices just in case they'd done something wrong. So he knew where his blessings were coming from. He was a man who feared God. He was a good man. So that's the background. That's who Job was. And then the next section in Job is what I've called the first challenge. And so what happens is God is meeting in heaven with with the other heavenly beings and Satan, who is known as the accuser. That's what his name needs. God says to Satan, "Have you considered Job?" He says, "Have you considered Job? There's none like him. He's blameless, he's upright, he fears God, shuns evil." And Satan says, "Well, there's a reason for that. That's only because you bless him. If you take away his stuff, he'll turn around and curse you." He's almost saying to God, he's like a pet that you give food to. He loves you because you give him, because you bless him. And God says, "Okay then, do your worst, but don't touch the man himself." And so then we get this scene, or these several events that happen to Job. So Satan's given permission to do his worst, and you get it's almost like a sort of a classical play. You get the people coming from all directions saying, "Your house has burnt down. People attacked you. The winds, there was fire. Your winds came and blew down the building that your sons and daughters were in." And all of a sudden, he's lost all his possessions, his servants, and his sons and daughters have been killed. So his wife remains, but really Job has lost everything in that one short time. And what does he say? He says, "Naked I was born, and naked I will die." He doesn't curse God. So that's the first challenge. And what happens next? Well, what happens next is the second challenge. And this is very interesting, the fact that there's two challenges, because I don't know if you've come across this, but apparently it's a fact that when we go into a difficult situation, we go in with, we all go in with a certain amount of willpower. And it's like, we've got a store of willpower. And they've done tests on this, and they found that people, if they expend some of that willpower on one thing, then they've got a lot less willpower the next time round. So if you're hit twice, it's very different. The second time, if something you've been through something awful, you may withstand it, but then something else happens, it's much, much more difficult to bear. And this is what happens to Job. So we go back to what's happening in the heavens, and God says, "Look at Job. He kept his integrity. He did okay." And Satan says, "Well, what if you let me strike his body?" He says, "Skin for skin. What's going to happen if you let me actually strike his flesh, if you strike the man himself? Then he will curse you." And God says, "Okay, but spare his life." And so then Satan does strike his body, and it says that he afflicts Job with sores all over his body. And Job is left in this terrible situation. He's lost everything, and it says he sits among the ashes, scraping himself with a piece of pottery to try and ease his sores. And if you like, then the killer blow, if you like, is the comment from his wife. His wife says, "Curse God and die." Imagine hearing that from your spouse. "Curse God and die." And what does Job say? He says, "You foolish woman, shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" So that's quite an attitude, isn't it? So that's the second challenge. So that's sort of what happened to Job. And then the story takes quite an interesting turn, because then his friends turn up, and his friends try and help. So this is the next part of Job. And, they don't do that good a job, really. So they start off very well. They sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, if you've got a friend who's in trouble, have you ever sat with them for 7 days and 7 nights? It's not bad, is it? It's pretty good. They sit in silence with him for 7 days and 7 nights. But after a while, patience starts to run out, and they start to debate with him. And basically what they say is, God is just. We know God does what's right. you must have done something bad. Somewhere in your youth or childhood, you must have done something bad. And Job says, no, I didn't. I didn't do anything wrong. And then we get in this sort of circular thing where Job's saying, I don't want to live. I wish I'd never been born. And his friends are saying, well, he must have done something wrong. And then he's saying, I didn't do anything wrong. And it goes round and round and round. And that happens for, it goes from, I don't know how many chapters, but a lot of chapters. We hear these arguments. And one of the things that really comes out there is Job's reaction, because Job doesn't just say, I wish I was dead. He really says, I wish I'd never been born, and he absolutely means it. And if you read the text, that's one thing that really comes out, is he's almost cross that he's been allowed to be alive because things are so bad. And his friends really they're trying, but they're not really being any help at all. And then finally, God speaks. And but that's where it all gets a bit puzzling, because he doesn't really explain anything. God just asks a lot more questions. And he says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Have you ever given orders to the morning? Where's snow kept? How does lightning formed? And he just has this stream of unanswerable questions. And eventually, Job just says, surely I've spoken things that I did not understand. He's just overawed by the greatness of God and what a different place he's in. And that's nearly the end. Finally, we get to the epilogue. And what happens then? Well, God is angry with Job's friends. He says, they've not spoken of me what is right. And he tells Job to pray for his friends, which he does, and they're forgiven. And then what happens? Well, God blesses Job with more than he ever had before. So it's quite a puzzling sort of story, really. And certainly I've read it lots of times, always been quite fascinated by it, but found it puzzling. So what is going on here? Well, I think there's quite a few. We're not going to unravel the whole thing today, but I think there's some things we can really learn from it. And the first thing I want to talk about is why does God test people like that? What's going on there? And it really, for me, I used to work as an engineer. I used to work in designing cars and parts for cars. And that whole thing of being tested really struck a resonance with me. Let me just tell you a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about that, and perhaps it will make sense. So, when you're designing something as an engineer, it can be quite a process. You start off, you think about what you want to make and what it's got to do, and you go for a long period of designing it. And sometimes after a few years, so it's actually made, and you've put in a huge investment into this item. And then the next thing is it has to get tested, and basically you and lots of other people try as hard as they can to break it. And it's a really strange feeling when you're watching that thing being tested, because on the one hand you've got a huge emotional investment in it, and you really want it to do well. On the other hand, you're putting it through all these things and you're trying to break it. It's a really funny, strange sensation to go through. And let me ask you a question. What was God's opinion of Job? What did God think of Job? What was his opinion of him? He thought he was good and he was strong. Yeah, he was. If you go right back to the beginning, where it's talking right at the beginning about Job, he says, consider Job, there's none like him. There's none like him. When Satan challenged God, that was a huge thing, if you like, in a spiritual sense. That was a challenge to God's authority. And who did God put up for it? He put his best man forward. Job was his best man. He loved that man. He thought he thought there was none like him. And I think that's something when we're being tested that we need to understand. When God tests us, he's testing the people he loves. He's putting his best people forward. And I think that when we experience suffering, although we don't understand necessarily what's going on, there's much more going on in the heavenly realms than we do understand. I think, and what we're going through is actually important in a spiritual sense. When God tests us, he's using the people that he thinks highly of. The fact that we're being tested is an indication that God thinks highly of us. And I think we're actually much more important than we realise. It's interesting, the challenge that was put forward was not to curse God. And in fact, Job didn't. He complained, he was confused, he found everything difficult, he didn't understand what was going on, but he never cursed God. And Job was continually looking to God for relief. He was acknowledging that the wisdom and power belonged to God. So I think the thing we need to remember when we undergo that suffering is that it's happening for a reason. It's happening. We're actually much more important than we realise. So the other question is, what do we do in the church when we see people suffering? We don't want to be like Job's friends. We need to recognise those who are suffering. We need to not pretend that we have all the answers. And we need to have time for them. And we need to acknowledge that what they're going through is important. And in fact, I think we need to honour those who are suffering for their fortitude, because I think that when we see people suffering in the church, they're actually going through, if they're being tested by God, they're actually doing something important for the church. So those are some thoughts on suffering. and I hope that'll give you something to think about.
That's quite a different perspective, isn't it? Because I doubt there's a person in the room who hasn't suffered in some way. Whether that's big ways or small ways. So we're not going to pretend we have the answers. Looking at this, that's not the response we're looking for. But I wonder if we can just spend a bit of time in quiet, just considering about the importance of the things we've gone through. So I don't think I do quite understand this sort of stuff in the cosmic realm, so to speak, in terms of God putting people forward, but I do believe that is what happens. I do believe, actually, we've heard a bit of spiritual truth this morning. So I think I'd like us just to take a bit of quiet. I don't want everybody to feel they have to come out and share all their suffering, although if people want to talk about their own experience, that will be fine. But for those of you that are going through challenging times, I think there needs to be some acknowledgement that that's an important thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. We're not going to be like Job's friends saying, you must have done something wrong. And if it's carrying on longer, for goodness sake, haven't you had enough time to get your life straight? Because that's what happens, isn't it? We could be like Job's friends. Maybe we wouldn't sit in silence for 7 days, but we can be around and offer a bit of comforts to start with, and then it keeps going on, and then it keeps going on. And you end up thinking, is this my fault? Is it me? Whereas actually, that's not the message we've been hearing, and I don't think that's God's truth in this situation, where things are longer term, and there isn't an easy answer. we need to acknowledge what's going on. I think we need to take a moment of quiet. We'll do that. I think there's some folks in this congregation that we know are facing tough times. There's other people who may want to share with their neighbour or just reach out for a bit of prayer and a bit of comfort. So let's just take a bit of time for that. Chris, would you mind just playing a little bit in the background? Would that be okay? Just something quiet. Is that okay? And we'll just take a bit of quiet.